Well, hello, ladies, and hello, gentlemen. I'm Jack Fowler, the Senior Fellow at the Center for Civil Society at American Philanthropic, and I'm a thrilled man. I'm thrilled that I get to be the host of this webinar with two truly important public intellectuals discussing a topic that's truly of importance to all Americans and to civil society. Our topic today is the fragility of citizenship, and our two participants are men who have spent a lot of time thinking about citizenship in America and its consequences and its status. And they are Tony Woodleaf. And Tony is the executive vice president at the State Policy Network, also known as SPN. And I don't know if this will come out backwards on the screen, but he's the author of iCitizen, a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance. This was published by Encounter Books earlier this year. And then also with us is my dear friend for many years, Victor Davis Hanson. Victor is the Martin and Ely Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He teaches at Hillsdale College. He is a farmer, best-selling author of about 24 books, syndicated columnist, military historian, classicist. And one of the books that he's published, and this is a New York Times bestseller. This is I'm holding up the paperback edition. I have the hardcover back there. I paid for them both, Victor. This is The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. I think our people who are watching this today will agree with me. We've got two aces here to discuss this important topic. A couple of program notes before we begin. I'll be asking Victor and Tony questions. If you'd have a question you would like to ask, there is a Q&A function on Zoom. Pose a question and I will try to get to it during the course of this hour. I also want to mention I'm wearing a tie given me by Shraga Kawi, our great friend of ours. I just have to say that that's an important program note. So anyway, the fragility of citizenship, that's our topic. And I think the fragility, the title is not a question mark, and it's not necessarily a statement either, but two things about it. I want to ask you both, in both, take it on however you see fit. Is citizenship a fragile thing by nature, A? And then in America in 2022, is it fragile as we commonly understand fragile? It's fragile, it's weak, it could break. And then the question of, well, if it breaks, is it repairable? Victor, you take it, that's like an object. Victor, your title of your book is The Life and Death theme. So is it at the point where it can be healed? So Tony, I'd like to start with you. Tell us what your concept of citizenship is. Is it fragile? Is it in danger in America? And I will get to you later about some of the points you make in your book about political division in America. So let's hold off on that for the time being. And then Victor, after Tony's done, have at it. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, thank you, Jack, for having me. I don't thank you for making me go first, because I was really hoping to hear what Victor had to say, and then I was going to not agree. So Victor, be gentle if I'm wrong. But the first question is citizenship fragile. I think it's as fragile as, human connection to place and human connection to human, right? So that can be a very powerful bond. People will die for that. But if you don't have the sorts of institutions that promote that, institutions of family and faith and so on, then yes, it can become very, very thin, and then it becomes brittle. And I think that's what we see in America today. Something that has been an enduring source of strength for the country, that has defined the lives of generations. People went and died for this country in many wars, fought to expand their freedoms here. That was all rooted in a love of place and a love of family, and that extends over time to a love of your community and country. So as we denude those institutions, you imperil citizenship, I would say. And just a little preview for my book, my argument in part is that by taking authority out of communities, you have begun to erode any kind of citizen obligation, right? We've shrunken citizenship to voting, every 2 years, and maybe serving on a jury. So when you remove authority from communities, you remove one of the pillars of citizenship, which is participation together in determining political outcomes.
And thanks, Tony. We'll get back on that very important Tocquevillian theme. Victor, of fragile, and I should ask you also to put in rare, because I know you've written about citizenship is something we enjoy it here in America. I don't know if we enjoy it much anymore, but historically, you look through history on all kinds of through all different lenses. If you look through the lens of citizenship, it is a rare thing over the course of the last 5,000-6,000 years. So, Victor, put a little history on it, but also give us your assessment of the fragility of citizenship in America today, please.
Well, yes, it came very late to civilization. It didn't appear to about 2,500 years ago in 7th century Greece. And prior to that, there were residents, there were subjects of a king, there were serfs, there were slaves. But citizenship was a radical idea of self-governance, that the individual citizen or resident was privileged in that he, and we're talking about males in the ancient world, alone created the circumstances under which he would live. In other words, passed on inheritance, made laws, voted for officials, determined what degree he was subject, if at all, to taxes, things like that. And it requires a lot of time, and it requires a lot of responsibility, much more than a subject or a mere resident or a peasant or indentured servant or something. So it was very rare in the ancient world, and it started in Greece and transmogrified into Rome, but it didn't survive either one of those places eventually until it was rediscovered really during the Renaissance, especially in the Italian republics. But today, if you look at the 180 or so recognized nations in the world, I think you can make the argument only about 90 of them are consensual, and therefore there's an idea of a citizen. And here, as to your second question, yeah, I think it's becoming very endangered. And you can define that a lot of ways, either by de jure or de facto citizenship. If you say de jure or by law, then the exclusivity between a citizen and a resident that distinguished them has almost disappeared. If we were to have this conversation maybe 50 years ago, we would say only a citizen can vote, a resident cannot. Only a citizen can participate in a political campaign, a resident cannot. Only a citizen can serve on a jury, a resident cannot. Only a citizen can hold military, can be in the military, a resident cannot. Only a citizen can hold political office. And even, I think, if you said prior to 1970, only a citizen can be a recipient of federal aid. But in the series of Supreme Court decisions and some legislation, all of those distinctions, I should add also, Jack, only a citizen could leave on his own free accord across boundaries, the border. You can go somewhere without having to have permission from the government. You had a passport. But I'd say now all of those distinctions have been erased, except I think you could still argue only citizens hold political office. But here in California, Berkeley, for example, non-citizens can vote in school board elections. We have non-citizen appointees in the state government. And I shouldn't say non-citizens, I should say people who are illegally non-citizens. We all know that for the last 50 years, people who were non-citizens served in the military. We saw from Christopher Steele that non-citizens can participate very muscularly in a political campaign. But de facto, so the legal distinctions and exclusivities of citizenship have been eroded vis-a-vis just mere residency. But if you look at de facto, that is all of what Tony mentioned, all of the accompanying protocols, habits, tradition, customs that enhance the legal exclusivity of a citizen, they have eroded too. And by that I mean this idea of the melting pot, that we all in a multiracial society are asked to make our superficial appearance incidental rather than essential to who we are. And we pledge that our American identity supersedes our Swedish or Greek or Mexican or Black identities. That we're re-tribalizing, where a large number of people feel that their primary identity is not so much American, but ethnic or religious or sexual or gender. That's disturbing. I think also that the reinforcement of citizenship, iconic monuments, iconic names of the past, the idea that you didn't have to be perfect to be good in the American story, the idea that we had just to be better than the alternative. And so we had songs, we had customs, saluting the flag. So when you look at that in its totality, we have major figures that make the argument in the flesh that they don't need to stand up for the national anthem, Colin Kaepernick, or patriotic songs like Kate Smith singing God Bless America will be banned. Or when you go to the schools today, and I still go once in a while to speak, you can see people who don't know how to pledge the Pledge of Allegiance. They don't know the formula for it, much less do they ever heard of My Country 'Tis of Thee or America the Beautiful. If you ask them about iconic presidents, who is Lincoln, who is Washington, they don't know. Iconic events, what is the 4th of July? What was the Battle of Gettysburg? What's the Emancipation Proclamation? All of this is foreign. And then finally, we have 50 million people who were not born in the United States of various legal statuses. And that, in terms of percentage and actual numbers, is the largest we've ever had. And so you ask yourself, was there an effort by the government to inculcate them with the elements of citizenship and integrate and assimilate them into the body politic? And the answer is no. So I can go, say, 5 miles from here, and I can go to communities where English is not spoken, and nobody in a market will know really what couldn't define the 4th of July. And these are not just people who came from southern Mexico. These are people who've been here for 30 years, 40 years. So we have a large number of people who are disconnected from the embryo of citizenship, and then citizenship itself legally is under assault. And I think there's a lot of people that want to make it indistinguishable from residency.
Yeah, I'd like us to, later on, we'll get into who it's under assault from, how conscious is this a matter of assault, who fears citizenship ideologically, if anyone does. But Tony, I want to talk about some of the things in your book first, and then Victor, we'll get back to you on some of those other questions. You talk much about you do talk much about politics in your book. You talk much about, of course, civil society, but there's a claim that half of America hates the other half, and this is important to what you're writing about. Is it true? Of course, it's repeated constantly, and there's nothing wrong with it being repeated constantly if it is true. But if it's not true, then it's a lie, and if it's a lie, why is it important for this lie to be repeated? So what is the situation, Tony? Does half of America hate the other half? And if it doesn't, why is this being propagated?
No, half the country doesn't hate the other half. And the reason why might frustrate, my friends who are more ideologically, constant and committed. The reality is most Americans are not that invested in politics. They don't have a firm ideology. When you do try to pin them down in a survey, if you can get a reliable survey, and I'll just stipulate most surveys at this point are incredibly unreliable. To do a survey well takes a lot of money. And every media organization knows you can do a terrible survey really cheaply and you'll get the same number of clicks. So the reliable surveys we have, we try to pin people down on ideology. When you force them to say what they are, they cluster center right, and they don't even like to say that they're very liberal or very conservative. They say they're moderate, they say they're somewhat, and we see this borne out in behaviors as well. But you ask them about free enterprise, you ask them about toleration, about religion. Americans tend to be very tolerant and somewhat center right, and not that animated about either party. And most Americans dislike both parties, and especially the leaders of those parties. So that's not a description of two armed or soon to be armed camps. It's a description of regular Americans who are kind of imprisoned in a sort of two-party system where both parties have terrible brands. So then the question is, well, why does this narrative continue to be propagated by pundits on both sides of the, or across the spectrum? I think one simple reason is that conflict sells. We know that major publications like the Washington Post, they have reporters who are on the polarization beat. And if you hire me as a reporter and you say, Tony, you're on the rutabaga beat, well, I'm going to go find some rutabagas for you, right? So you hire reporters and say, cover polarization. They're going to bring you the story about the family who can't get along at Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
But most people are not that family. I think an additional function of the narrative is that it justifies this continued undemocratic concentration of power in Washington, D.C., right? Because if every election, it could be the one that finally tips us into socialism or fascism, then you're allowed to do whatever it takes to win. You can cut corners, you can dictate from the White House instead of trying to pass things through a legislature. So it justifies that kind of behavior until we reach the point now where for every law Congress does pass, federal agencies create 28 laws that have the full effect, full force. That's not really representative of democracy. And you get to that point once you've created this sort of environment where all the political actors believe that they've got to beat the other side or the country's finished.
Well, Tony, the let's go back to, and we're going to claim, and I don't think any of you will agree because you've stated this in various ways already, that citizenship in America in 2022 is in rough shape, maybe even bad shape. Part of it, Tony, from what I got from your book is, as you just mentioned, it's the aggrandized state. As the state grows, I think that the two forces are civil society and the state. And as the state grows, it grows at the expense of civil society, and bureaucrats have to be bureaucrats. They have to take away the consent of the governed. They take that power unto themselves. So there's some sense of the decline of citizenship that goes with the state growing. But I also believe there must be some ideological distrust and disdain for the state of citizenship by certain actors. And if you would talk about that, I would appreciate it, and maybe on a domestic level. And Victor, I know, and Tony, you talked about this on a global level too. And then Victor, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that because, as we've discussed on podcasts that we've done, and you've written about and written in this book, there's a global dimension to the assault on citizenship also. So, but Tony, talk about that. Who's to blame? Who's got it out for citizenship?
Sure. Well, it's tempting to try to say, that the Republicans are more at fault or the Democrats are more at fault. What I focus on in the book is this, I call them a professional political class. These are the people who benefit. Who benefits, right, from this concentration of power? You see, who benefits from the fact that when home values across the country, they dip, they just keep going up. In the city I'm visiting right now, I'm looking out my window into Georgetown, and across the river is, the district, and you've got the surrounding area. The home values always go up here, right? So who benefits from this system? And it's a professional political class, and they maintain their position in part by sowing this division among regular folks, and also by keeping power here. The minute that you send authority back into communities, you diminish authority here. And I think part of the reason for that, as you alluded, Jack, is that folks in this political class, at a very basic level, they don't trust regular Americans. They're not fans of the preamble to the Constitution. They don't like we the people. They mostly don't know we the people, right? They don't share our values. And I've seen this on the left and the right. I don't know what the quantity is in terms of, each side who dislikes Americans more, but there's a fundamental distrust of and dislike of regular Americans that you hear in the discourse from both sides of the aisle. And I think that also justifies the concentration of power. I see it in my friends who are.
Is this the low information voter that you?
Yeah, right. There's that, that what are they don't know enough. They don't know anything. Look how they failed at political surveys. Let's go out on the street and stick a microphone in some drunk's face and ask him who the head of the Supreme Court is and laugh at him because he doesn't know. And sure, Americans have always been maybe a little dull compared to, sophisticated Parisians, right? They're not on top of the political news. But I think there's a horse sense, there's a common sense among Americans, and there's a deep patriotism still among Americans. And just as an example, if you've ever served on a jury, right, you're going to get like a wide swath of people coming into that room. My experience is, regardless of education level and whatever kind of faint indications of ideology may exist among the people in that room, you see generally in those days, regular Americans really try to do a good job. They really try to be good citizens and deliver justice. And to me, that illustrates how when you give regular Americans some authority, they still treat it seriously, far more seriously than many of the people in Washington, D.C. But I think it's all rooted in a distrust. We're afraid of what might happen if we let people run their schools again and their nursing homes and all the other things that Washington continually exerts control over.
Victor, I not disagreeing with you, what you said there, Tony, thank you, but I'd like to posit that there is a more of an ideological disdain for citizenship that comes from the left than from the right. Historically, Victor, of course, we've seen citizen in the French Revolution, and of course the communist, the Soviet Revolution, right? Wasn't the word citizen used? Citoyen, citizen Duval, or citizen Kerensky. These were the use of the word citizen by the left sort of had a kind of a hijacked sense to it. But actually, if you have any historical perspective on that, I'd appreciate it. But on global level, there is a globalist movement that does disdain sovereignty and national citizenship. And we see that, I believe we see that in the European Union. Anyway, yeah. Victor, globally, that's part of your book. We're talking globalization is a threat to citizenship. How so?
Well, I try to look at what are the forces that openly and confidently deprecate the exclusivity or the uniqueness of citizenship. So who is it that says we should have 2 or 3 million people just come across the border in time of a pandemic? We won't have any audit. We won't ask anything of them. We won't ask any criteria, no background check. Who is that? Or on the other extreme, who are the people who are saying that the globalist project should supersede this archaic 19th century idea that this is a nation, it has a border, it has to be defended? Who are the people who want to aggregate the European nation state into one large area? Or who are the people who think that there shouldn't be really a border between Mexico and the United States and Canada? And so that's what I ask. And it seems to me that when I look at ideology today, it's coming from the left, mostly exclusively. I mean, it used to be the corporate right, of course, wanted cheap labor and all that. But when I see an administration on the left come into power, then before they've even said anything, I can tell you what they're going to do. They're going to promote a globalist view of things. And what would that mean? That would mean we might want the International Criminal Court to adjudicate whether American soldiers are behaving in Afghanistan rather than the United States military. Or we might say, as Tony Blinken did, let's have the UN Commission on Human Rights come in and adjudicate whether the United States is systemically racist, because we trust more in that. Or it might be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, saying, I think a model for our own Constitution and Supreme Court might be the new South African Constitution. As far as, so that seems to me essential to the progressive project, which is antithetical to a nation state and a unique culture and civilization within defined borders. And that attack on that is coming from the left. I'm pretty sure of that. And then secondly, I'm a little bit less optimistic because we do have a federalist system in the United States, and geography can be a force multiplier of difference. And when we had every time we've had a serious crisis in this country, geography became a force multiplier of ideology. The most infamous case, of course, is 1861 to 1865, but that divide had been growing since probably the founding of the country. So when we have a 1930s 32-29 crisis during the Great Depression, or we have a 60s cultural revolution, that is not to the same degree regionally specific. This one is. And by that, I mean, if you go to Florida and you go to California, you're starting to see, in a way you did not 20 years ago, entirely antithetical cultures, as far as taxation, as far as the reaction to COVID, as far as homelessness, as far as, and if you go into Michigan, and I stay a month in Michigan every year, and if you go in Michigan and you go to Tennessee, they're very different cultures, and they're becoming more antithetical to each other. And so that is something that I think everybody has to be attuned to. And then culturally, I think there's been a big split. The events that used to unite people no longer are there. So if you ask, half the country, do you watch the Super Bowl halftime show? They'll say no. Or if you say, when's the last time you saw an NBA game, or they won't watch it. Or if you tell them, have you been to a movie lately, a first run movie at a theater? No, I don't go to that. Or if you say to, have you watched the network news? No, I don't know that at all. Do you read the paper of record, the New York Times? No, I wouldn't read that. So we're self-selecting culturally, politically, socially, in a way that I hadn't seen during earlier cultural or social or political turmoils. I mean, I lived through the 60s, and there were more conservative, more liberal areas of the country, but that movement did not try to, the movement was, we're going to be young and we're going to win over the country, all of us. But it was not based on, I can't participate in this project any longer, so I'm going to move to this particular state, and I'm going to have an alternate universe within America. And so that is new. And the second thing, very quickly, is I didn't see people who were serious in the past about changing the very fundamentals, the customs and protocols of the Constitution and the habits and customs that grew up around it. What do I mean by that? I haven't seen somebody like, so Barack Obama gives a eulogy at a funeral, and in it he says he wants statehood for Puerto Rico and DC. We've had 60 years of a 50 state union, and that's very common now. I had not seen anybody seriously say, we want to get rid of the 180-year-old filibuster. That's very common. In fact, it's on the lips of everybody as soon as they end on the Democratic Party. I hadn't seen anybody. It used to be a dirty word to say you wanted to pack the court. It was a dirty word because of the notorious 38-39 failed effort by FDR. Today, Elizabeth Warren will say on the Senate floor, we've got to have 15 judges. I haven't seen people say, seriously, we've got to destroy the Electoral College. It's a racist artifact, ossified, calcified, get rid of. That's a very, the National Voter Compact is almost there now, where once the sufficient number of states can pledge 270 electoral votes, and each state takes a pledge not to reflect their constitutional duty to pick electors on the basis of their state totals, but rather the federal total, then you can get around you can destroy the Electoral College without the amendment process. So these are fundamental revolutionary measures, and I haven't seen that before. And I know it's infectious. So the other day, Donald Trump said that given the recent developments with Twitter and FBI revelations, that he was prescient in suggesting that the vote was rigged. And therefore, he tweeted, that the Constitution might have to be in some areas ignored or suspended to allow a kind of a replay of the 2020 election or his appointment. So once you start to question these sacrosanct rules and regulations that we've lived up with, we have an amendment process, but once you're saying that they are bankrupt or racist or they're unfair it's synonymous with the acquisition of power. I say that cynically because Barack Obama, in that same, I'm not trying to pick on him, but in that same eulogy, he said that the filibuster was a racist Jim Crow relic, even though he tried to use it effectively in 2006 to stop the appointment of Justice Alito. So what I'm getting at, just to sum up, people are starting to self-segregate in a way that is geographically and ideologically reinforcing that separation. And we are people of responsibility in the country that are trying to alter the very mechanism in which the constitutional republic has worked for 233 years.
Yeah.
And you can see it. Final thing is, we saw in a number of states, here in California, about 74% of the people did not vote on election day. That was a revolution. The election day was a sacrosanct civic duty. And under the guise or cover or veneer of COVID, we've had the biggest revolution in our country, because we've got about 30 states now where 75% of the people do not vote in person on election day, and where there is some type of face-to-face encounter, or you can have a voter ID. And that was a complete flip from 2016. We went in 2012, all of a sudden we decided, well, there's no such thing as election night returns anymore that are definitive. There's no such thing as this ritual. We're all going to go out and there's going to be about 25% of people who are sick or at work that will vote absentee, but 75 or 80% will vote. That is rather revolutionary. We haven't even fathomed the ramifications of that yet.
Oh, well, today, Victor, is December 6th at St. Nicholas Day. And I feel like you just stuck a big lump of coal in everyone's stocking there, but that's the reality. But Tony, I'd like you, I have a question or two about citizenship, Tony, and then I'd like to talk about the point of your book was to reclaim. So briefly, if you will, let's talk about, first of all, is self-governance and citizenship the same thing, essentially?
Well, I think in the American context, they're closely linked. I don't think it has to be, I don't think they're essentially linked. You can have all manner of nations, in states where citizenship, it can be sort of centralized government, and there's not a lot of room for self-governance. But in the American context, in some respects, self-governance began before national citizenship, right?
Yeah.
Colonies, and then you had states, and then we, the people, elected to form a national government of which we would be citizens. And all that was rooted in an ethos of self-governance, of course, beginning at the most basic level with the governance of the self, which, so there's a primary importance of religious faith in a certain, Judeo-Christian context. And then you had the self-governance of the community, right? And so you have these concentric circles, and then you land at a nation state, which is an essential component of survival in a world of nation states, to be sure. But so certainly in the American context, I don't know what American citizenship looks like if self-governance has no meaning.
It's interesting what you just brought up, and I do want, after this, talk about your blueprint for reclaiming citizenship. But you talked about essentially the religiosity of America, and John Adams and others had written it. This experiment, this republic can work, but it can only work for a moral people and a virtuous people, which I will imply meant a religious people. And with the decline in religiosity, I think would you see that as an extra challenge to reclaiming citizenship in America in 2022?
I think so. I think, again, going back to surveys, I'm not an expert here, but I think there is some cause to question some of the survey evidence that purports to show that Americans have less religious faith. I think there's certainly, a decline in some regards. But if you step back from that, you might ask, well, a decline in what? If you see a decline in the sort of non-liturgical, non-serious kind of faith tradition, is that really a problem compared to a decline in sort of a genuine committed faith? So I'm not sure what that trend looks like long term. I think there's some question there. I'm not the person to suss it out, but there's no question that the entire sort of software of the American Constitution, the whole framework, depends on a hardware of a virtuous people. And we absolutely have lost the ability to even talk about virtue in our public schools. And so I don't know how you sustain the constitutional republic if you don't have institutions sustaining the virtue of the people.
We have a question or two about that regard. I want to make a program note or two. And Tony, I'm gonna ask you about the solution, the blueprint, and Victor, I have a question to you if you're following that. First, I do want to once again let people know if they have any questions, they can ask it. Pose it in the question box there. And 2 days from now, on December 8th, if you're watching this live, the Center for Civil Society, which exists to strengthen civil society, will have another webinar. My great colleague John Hanna is overseeing, and it's on effective altruism. Is it truly effective or altruistic? And given what Sam Bankman-Fried, the great effective altruist of our current times, has done, it couldn't be a timelier topic. So you can sign up for that at American Philanthropic under events, and there's also a link in the chat. Tony, this book is a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance. What is the essence of the blueprint that you are proposing?
Sure, and I'll try to speak up. I see in the notes I might be a little hard to hear. I apologize. My wife has never accused me of that, so it's I'll speak up. So the blueprint, I struggled when writing the book because books like this, the author is always tempted to show how smart he is by providing the silver bullet, which you can't make. So, the solution is, let's have federalism again. The solution is politicians should reform themselves, right? So I was thinking, well, what could you actually do as a person? And, ultimately you have the domain that you have control over is very small, and it begins with your own heart. And then you work outward from there, right? I've never trusted people who have great love in their hearts for the whole world, but they don't love their neighbor. So I figure, why not start with that, right? With your own behavior and how you treat your neighbor. And then, channeling Tocqueville, maybe you begin to solve problems together in your community and your neighborhood. And then maybe start taking an interest in your local government, especially your local school, right? Which is often an extension of your government. And then go outward from there. So it's not a silver bullet, but I don't think any real reform movement ever is, right? I wouldn't trust some from the top, elect a great man or pass a great law solution to America's problems. I think you've got to think about it like a sick body, and healing takes time, right? And a steady application of exercise and medicine. So right. That's what I talk about in the book, is the small but important things that are our obligations, I would say, as people of faith, if you have a faith, but also as citizens. So that's what the blueprint is. Okay.
Well, you mentioned education. This is a good jumping off point for one of the questions we've received, and that's from E. Christian Kopp, who writes, he asks, can we restore citizenship without restoring classical education to a dominant or at least significant position in K through 12 education, as with the founders? Tony, what are your thoughts about that? And Victor, then you.
I'm going to defer to Victor. I'll simply say that I believe that much of the history of the American Republic, we did not have generations of scholars. We had moral people, who worked hard in their communities, and they had an obedience to their faith and a love for their communities and their place. And it worked pretty well. I'm not saying you don't need a classical education, but I think there's a deeper rooting you need as well.
Victor, you are a scholar, a classicist. I've got to think you have a prejudice for classical education, but what were your thoughts on that question? Victor, your sound is off.
I don't think you have to have a classical education in the most strict sense, but civic education was built on just a classical familiarity with how government in the consensual sense works. So when you were in 3rd or 5th grade, you were told this is a legislative body, this is a Supreme Court body, this is a executive body, and they have checks and balances. That wasn't very hard to teach a 10-year-old. And what did that mean? That meant that if you're an informed citizen and somebody says, well, the Republicans have taken control of the House and now they're going to do the following, the informed citizen says that's going to be very hard because they don't have the presidency and they don't have the Senate. And under our system of government, they have very narrow channels of reform. Or if you say, well, you hear in the news that the FBI is talking to a news aggregator or maybe a social media, sort of like almost a public utility, and suggesting that these types of views be censored, then the civic-minded citizen says, well, wait a minute, I know something about the First Amendment. I understand that I have freedom of expression, and the government, in this case, through the vehicle of the FBI, cannot squash my ability to express myself. So you need those abilities of citizens, a general awareness of what they can do and what they can't do as citizens. The other thing is, there's been a long philosophical tradition, and I don't subscribe to it, but it went something like this, starting with Plato, but more importantly, you could really see it in the German nihilist tradition, Hegel, Nietzsche, Spengler. And it went that if you combine constitutional government that gives freedoms to the individual, and that is in the context of a free market economy, private property, that creates a lot of material bounty to the excess, then it's very important that the citizen know, and this is getting back to your question about virtue, that they don't do what they're legally entitled to do. In other words, that they have some moral restraint. They don't just say, well, the society is very, very wealthy, and it's my legal right as a small employer that I get a lot of COVID money. I don't need the COVID money. I don't really qualify, but if they're going to send me a check, I'm going to take it, because it's very hard if you don't have classical or religious virtue for that citizen to say, well, wait a minute, that would only contribute to a $31 trillion debt. And these people have mistakenly done this, and I don't need it or I don't qualify for it. And so this antithetical tradition in the philosophical history says, humans are not capable. Look what happened to Athenians. They just voted themselves more entitlements and largesse, and they took what they could. And because they were imperial and they were very wealthy, and they created an enervated citizen, or what the poet Catullus said, luxury, luxus, and he meant excess, will do you in still, Catullus. So when we're in these Western societies and you have all of this wealth and all of this freedom, and you compound that with atheism or agnosticism or ignorance of classical virtue and ethics, then you've got some things that'll go on. One of the things you're seeing is a declining fertility rate, because people feel life is so good or so free or so wonderful, and it's the only life we're going to have because we don't have a soul, that I don't want to waste my time with diapers. And I can justify it by saying, if I have children, they're not going to be able to enjoy a heated planet because of global warming. And so whatever the rationale is, you see these classical symptoms that start to kick in at various times in the West. And this is one of the times where fertility drops and cynicism increases, nuclear family starts to disintegrate, and everybody feels that they're going to take freedom to the nth degree, and they're going to enjoy material bounty that's created to the nth degree. And so if each entitlement that we now vote for, it's just a rule of law. It's an ironclad law that it will always be expanded. It will never be retracted. And yet we know that at some magical point, it'll collapse because you can't keep expanding something without increasing the funding element proportionally. And so that's something that's innate to human nature. And our founders, when they kept saying these homilies, this won't work without a virtuous people, what they were trying to say to us is, because they were versed in classical and Renaissance humanitarian Enlightenment literature, they were trying to say that this city on the hill experiment doesn't work in history very often, because people, even when they get a constitutional system and they're self-governed, they either vote themselves more at the expense of somebody else, they think, or they create a economic system that satisfies all their immediate needs and then leads to sort of decadence without self-restraint. And that self-restraint can only be inculcated either by formal religion or, as Tony said, a sense of religion doesn't have to be used, or a virtue system, a Socratic idea of virtue. But if you don't have that, then you start to see some of the trajectories I think that we are on right now.
Well, thanks, Victor. On that point, Daniel Kelly, who happens to be one of my dear friends, thanks for showing up here, Dan. He writes, how do we teach young people good citizenship and love of country? How do we defeat the nihilistic, instinctive loathing of patriotism that infects so many? Tony, I'd like you to take that on, but also, you might disagree that there is a instinctive loathing of patriotism that's widespread. You may agree, but is there widespread loathing of patriotism in America today? And that aside, any practical ideas, as Dan here asks, about teaching citizenship and love of country?
So the loathing, so well done surveys. You ask Americans things like, is this, what do you think of America compared to other countries in the world? Vast majority of Americans say that America is the greatest or one of the greatest countries in the world, including 80% of self-identified Democrats. So there's a widespread patriotism. How deeply does it run? Could we, storm the beach at Normandy again in courage and fortitude? I don't know, but there's still an instinct towards patriotism and an instinct towards love of country, which is, to me, fascinating, given how we've watched sort of schools become ineffective in so many ways, and churches become ineffective in so many ways. It's really quite a testimony to the fabric of the American Republic that there is still this much kind of latent, responsive patriotism. What's the depth of it? How brittle is it? It's very hard to say, but I find that encouraging. We don't have legions of young people who spit on the flag and don't love their country, but they're not very well educated about why they should love their country. And that is perilous.
Tony, I mentioned at the outset that you are the executive vice president at State Policy Network, and folks should look up SPN. And it's essentially an umbrella group that you may not like that terminology, but of state-based, liberty-loving organizations that probably, many years ago were more interested in let's say economic policy in the state capital or not. But in recent years, has civic education and these kind of issues related to citizenship, are you seeing state-based organizations that are pro-liberty, right of center, et cetera, becoming more involved with citizenship and enhancing citizenship and teaching citizenship? Is that something that's afoot today?
Education is the #1 policy issue for groups in the State Policy Network. And civics, of course, is a big part of that. But we're also seeing, kind of getting back to the question of what is a citizen, we've got something we call the Center for Practical Federalism. That's my key, responsibility at SPN. And we're bringing together these various state-based groups, litigation groups, legislative outreach, and it's a full court press against federal agencies, in communities. And a big part of that is you've got to really, stir up the sort of activist public to resist that kind of encroachment. And so there's a sort of a deeper kind of recruitment of, regular people to run for school boards, to get engaged and go, talk to their state legislators, go to their offices and let them know what you're thinking. So we're realizing you've got to have that kind of grassroots engagement if you're going to unite state-based groups against an overweening federal bureaucracy that is just beyond all constitutional boundaries.
Victor, I don't know that you propose a cure for what ails us here, but I'd like to think if you had ability to try to solve part of this, that one of the things you might address is the border situation of America, because and you can correct me, open borders means is an attack essentially an undermining of sovereignty, control of our borders. Would we have a less of a with a dying citizen in America?
Well, we have 50 million people here now that were not born in the United States of various statuses: citizens, residents, temporary green card holders, illegal aliens. 50 million. In terms of absolute numbers and percentages, that's the highest. I think we're up to 13%. Here in California, 27% of the state was not born in the United States. So that means that's an enormous challenge for the host to inculcate those students in Americanism. But if the host combines that challenge with a lack of confidence and transmits that lack of confidence, so somebody who's in Oaxaca State in Mexico crosses 2,500 miles and gets up here and then is told that there's not really much of a difference between a resident and a citizen, or it really wasn't that much of a law, or citizens in the United States have to get vaccinated to stay in the military, or they must take a test every 2 weeks, but you don't have to take a vaccination, and you don't have to take a test, and you don't have to come legally. And the person who's waiting in line for 3 years, say in South Korea or Spain, does, and that's going to be asymmetrical. So we have really taken that border and destroyed it. It doesn't exist anymore, at least as it used to. And that means that we, the host, don't have confidence in our own system anymore. We don't say to ourselves, there is a reason why 3 million people cross the border. And the host may say that we're sexist and we're racist and we're protectionist and we're nativist, but they don't think so, or they wouldn't come here. So we don't have national leaders that say, why are people trying to come to the United States? Is it because we're racist or we're flawed at the beginning? No, we're better than the alternative, and we don't have to be perfect to be good. So you can blind this utopianism that we have among our elites, that with lack of confidence, and that turns out to be a fatal message for somebody coming in here, especially without a high school diploma, without English, without legality, and without skills or capital. So that's disastrous in the same. And then when you look at your elites, take the NBA, you have I think we're getting to the point now with declining viewership. Just to take the NBA, their largest source of income will be franchising various teams all throughout China. And what does that mean? So you have an NBA coach, when he's asked, well, there's 1 million people in basically concentration camps in China, forced servile labor, and you people are endorsing Nike shoes that are created by slaves. Are you seeing anything wrong with that? And the first thing that the coach said was, well, we have mass shootings in the United States. In fact, we have 25 people die a year in mass shootings, quote unquote, on average in a nation of 330s. But this is a very educated, very wealthy, very a person who has profited enormously, as all NBA have. So if you have these iconic people and they don't see anything wrong with profiting in China, but they see everything wrong in the United States as a way of justifying their amorality, then you've got a crisis of confidence. It reminds me of the British elite of the 1930s. They didn't believe in anything anymore, and that was one of the reasons that the Germans felt that the appeasing class wouldn't do anything. So I'm really worried about that when, we had an emissary from Anthony Fauci who went over to China right after the outbreak and tried to tell us, the CDC, the NIH, the National Institute of Law, that the Chinese model was something that we should emulate because it was very much more effective in locking down people. And people like Bill Gates had said that as well. But what I'm getting at, we don't have a lot of voices anymore in entertainment, in Hollywood, in the corporate boardroom, in the foundations, in the university, that unequivocally will defend the American experiment, its maturity and its present status on the basis of it is better than the alternative. We're very lucky. We have wonderful ancestors. We had a huge and benevolent inheritance, and we're not going to be perfectionist in the sense that if we're not perfect, we're not good. We don't have those voices very often in the institutions that matter, and you can really see it. I work in this corridor between San Jose and San Francisco. It has $7 trillion of market capitalization: Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple. And yet it produces, this Twitter troll that we're hearing now, FBI working with Facebook, the Sam Bankman-Fried Bankman-Fried product grew up on the most intellectually challenging place in California that supposedly is par excellence a premier educational institution. Well, he didn't learn anything at Stanford. His parents are Stanford law professors, and they're very vocal and they're very prolific in condemning a lot of American institutions, and yet they bought $16 million with transfer assets out of investors' account in real estate. So I look at this elite, and then you can and how are people coming in going to learn anything about America when so many of our elites have lost confidence in it?
Well, let me. We only have about 2 minutes left, and before we leave, I do want to thank my colleagues Caitlin Nocera and John Hanna for helping get this going. And of course, Victor and Tony, thank you. Tony, I want to maybe wrap this up with you, and I know folks can see this poster over my shoulder here, and that's William F. Buckley's 1965 New York mayoral campaign, a few years after which he made the famous, that demand a recount, famous comment, 1,000 names in the Boston telephone directory, then the faculty Harvard. So we have this theme of disdain for the elite, and Tony, I think I'm going to again encourage folks to read your book, encourage folks to read Victor's book, but it's not the 3,000 names in the Boston telephone directory that's the problem here, is it? Is it the elite, however you might want to define it, that are causing the dying citizen, that are causing the disdain and self-governance that forces people like you to write books on how to reclaim it?
I use the term political class. I have nothing against elites. I think often in America, you're elite because you prove that you've got merit, but you've got a political class invested in division and concentrating authority in Washington, D.C. And that over time erodes what it means to be a citizen, because we don't have any authority in our communities over anything that matters. So the challenge is, how do you take that authority back from these people? And, our point of view, what we do in my organization is we push back against these federal agencies in courts, through state legislatures, in the media, every way we can, because if you don't do that, every state will become an administrative district of Washington, D.C. in the lifetimes of our grandchildren. And it doesn't have to be that way, because most Americans are with most of us most of the time on most things. So we the people is with us, and we just got to animate them.
Well, I'd like to conclude by saying, American Philanthropic's theme and the Center for Civil Society's theme is that we need to strengthen civil society. It's not just something that we need to do now, it's something we always need to do, because as civil society shrinks, the void is only filled by government. I want to thank again Victor, who is the author of The Dying Citizen, and Tony Woodleaf, who's the author of iCitizen. Thank you, gentlemen, for answering the questions, for providing some scintillating and truly inspiring conversation. And we will hope to see folks who are here. Please consider joining us on Thursday for our webinar on effective altruism. Is it truly effective or altruistic? Thank you very much. God bless all, and Merry Christmas.